Hi, I'm Brian E. Denton, author of the book A Year of War and Peace and the poetry collection Inspiration. Welcome to my channel. This video is part of a series I'm doing on Dante's Divine Comedy, wherein I am reading through the entire Divine Comedy, all three books, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, at a rate of 3 cantos or chapters per week. This is kind of my independent contribution to Baylor University's 100 Days of Dante Project. If you haven't heard of the 100 Days of Dante Project, there's a link down in the show notes. I encourage you to click through and go check it out. It's really great. A lot of top scholars offering their thoughts on Dante's Divine Comedy. If this is your first time visiting my channel, first of all, welcome. Thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy what you find here. If you do enjoy what you find, could you please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel? I've set myself the goal of getting to 200 subscribers by the end of October. At the time of recording, we're at 174, so that's a totally achievable goal with your help. So thanks in advance for that. Quick note about the organization of these videos. Each video contains a few different parts. You have this introduction, which I'm doing right now. This will be followed by a synopsis of the canto under discussion, wherein I'll cover the basic plot and the basic action. Then I'll move on to a characters and themes section, which is about the characters and themes. And after that, I'll offer a takeaway, which is my own personal feelings on the canto, coupled with how we can use the canto to live better lives ourselves. And then after that, I'll wrap things up with an outro. And then we'll go wherever the YouTube algorithm takes us. So with that, let's get right into it. Dante's Inferno, Canto 17. Virgil announces the presence of the infernal beast Geryon, and he describes this creature as a creature with a pointed tail that can leap mountains, shatter walls, and its stench afflicts the whole world. Geryon, who Dante the poet refers to as the foul effigy of fraud, perches on the cliff's edge, dangling its tail down into the abyss. After Geryon perches there on the cliff's edge, this offers Dante a better view of it. And what Dante sees is an infernal beast with the face and head of a human and the body of a winged serpent. It's interesting too because Dante the poet takes great pains to describe the vibrant colors of this infernal beast. And this, I believe, is one of the only, if not the only time in the entire poem where Dante the poet takes these pains to describe vibrant colors. And beyond that, of course, you have the patterns of the rings and the curlicues that dot the body of Geryon. And these are reminiscent of the leopard, which we met in the first canto, back in the dark wood. And it's this scary, colorful, menacing, infernal beast that our two heroes must hitch a ride on in order to get down deeper into the 8th ring of hell. Virgil understands that he's going to need to negotiate with Geryon to get a ride down into the 8th circle of hell. And so while he does this, he tells Dante to go familiarize himself and to do so quickly with the sinners that are gathered near them. So Dante goes over to look at these people, and it's not pretty. They crouch along the edge of the burning plain, and Dante notices that their faces, all of their faces, have been horribly, horribly disfigured, beyond all recognition. And what's more is all of them have this leather pouch hanging from their necks. And they're all intently focused on this leather pouch, instead of, the hailfire that's falling down on them. And this is what is leading to their faces becoming disfigured beyond all recognition because they're focused on this pouch hanging from their neck rather than trying to dodge, as the Sodomites did, the raining hellfire. And what's more is these pouches are emblazoned with family crests. And this is how Dante is able to know who these people are. He recognizes that they are the men and the rich families of Florence. So once again, we see that Florence is populating almost the entirety of hell. Dante, like most readers, I assume, quickly understands who these sinners are and what they're being punished for. And these sinners are the usurers. They're being punished for the sin of usury. At this point, Dante returns to Virgil, who has successfully negotiated passage down into the 8th circle of hell. And so Virgil ushers Dante onto the back of Geryon, and Geryon takes off, initiating their slow, menacing descent down into hell. Today's characters and themes section is going to cover 3 topics. We're going to cover the usurious characters that we meet. We're going to chat for a little bit about our 2 heroes. And then finally, we're going to discuss Geryon, the infernal beast that we meet in this canto. The usurers are a good place to begin our discussion here, because it's usury, according to Dante, that constitutes the sin of the violence against art that's being punished in this canto. And by art, what Dante means is work. And for those who don't know, usury is the lending of money at unreasonable rates of interest. And some would say at any rate of interest. All we need to know, though, is that if there is a line that is crossed in terms of the rates of interest being charged for money lending, the sinners in this canto definitely crossed that line. We never learn the names of the men in this canto. And this is important thematically because what Dante is probably trying to say here is that these sinners sacrificed their very identity and their obsessive chasing after money. They have, in effect, substituted their wealth for their names in terms of their identity. And we see this in a few different ways. First, their faces have all been horribly disfigured, and Dante takes great pains to really emphasize this point. He spends 3 whole tercets describing just the horrors of their faces, concluding that the disfigurement therein is so bad that probably no one could recognize these people. A second way that Dante shows that these men have robbed themselves of their identity by obsessing over money is that he has them obsess over money to the detriment of their own physical well-being. So we have in this canto these sinners, these usurers, focusing intently on their money pouches, not looking or not caring at the falling rain of fire. And what this achieves for them is what? The disfigurement of their face. So they would rather focus on keeping their money than keeping their very bodies, their very person, safe from the punishment of this circle of hell. And these pouches assume an almost religious reverence for these people. They hang over their chests like some demonic devotional scapular. Finally, these money pouches are decorated with their familial coat of arms. And this is actually how we can make an educated guess as to who these people are. But since everyone's primary school education no doubt included a detailed analysis of the medieval Florentine family crest, I won't insult anyone's intelligence by going into the details of the individuals concerned down here. All you need to know is that these sinners have so thoroughly identified themselves with their money that they put their family crests, the most intimate, the most important part of their personal identity, not with their family anymore, but with their money on the pouches that they hang over their chest. Now let's talk for a moment about our 2 heroes. I suspect that when most people read the poem for the first time, they read it like I do. Their eyes are more on the fantastical elements, the infernal beasts, the hellish punishments, and maybe they're not paying close enough attention to the 2 heroes of the poem, Virgil and Dante. And this makes a certain amount of sense because the punishments and the infernal beasts, these are all spectacular. They're all really cool. They're all really fun to read about. They're exciting. But it's odd, isn't it? I mean, in most pieces of literature, you want to focus on the main characters. You want to see how they develop and what it has to say about the story at large. You're not really focusing on the secondary characters, the ones who are just mentioned kind of in passing, right? Like we're not going to see Francesca or Paolo again. We're not going to see Geryon after he's gone. We're not going to see any of the angels, the fallen angels guarding the city of Dis. We are going to be, though, with Virgil and Dante. And one reason maybe why we don't consider them much is because they're not involved in a lot of the action. We've talked about this before, where I've said that this poem is more of a spiritual adventure rather than your traditional epic adventure. There's really not a great physical threat to Dante and Virgil, whereas there is a spiritual threat. So that's what I'd like to focus on today. In typical action-adventure epics, we watch with great interest as the main character grows with each step that he or she takes along the way of their hero's journey. Sometimes, for initial readers, it might seem like Dante isn't really developing at all. But he is. Look at him today. Did you notice that for only the second time in the poem, Virgil deems Dante ready to go off on his own without Virgil's guidance? And beyond that, this is the first time in the poem where Dante is able to go talk with the sinners alone without Virgil's help. This shows that Dante is growing, that he's maturing as a character, that he's learning. He's better able to confront these sins, perhaps without falling into the temptation to commit them. Now, this is very interesting that Dante the poet should choose the usurers for Dante to have this first experience, because, as you may or may not know, Dante the poet's father was actually a moneylender. And then there's Virgil. Has he grown at all? Has he changed? Is he dynamic? Yes, it turns out that he actually is. Recall the last time when they approached the city of Dis. Virgil had a lot of difficulty trying to get into the city of Dis. In fact, he failed. Remember, he had to call upon the help of divine intervention when the angel swooped down, cleared out all the rebellious angels, which allowed Virgil and Dante to enter the city of Dis. But that's not what happens here. It's as if Virgil has learned his lesson, and he takes the time to negotiate with Geryon for passage down into the eighth ring of hell. And he achieves this. So he's making progress too as a character. And now we've made it to Geryon, the real highlight of this canto. And what a character he is. Just amazing. The first thing to note is that Geryon represents the sins of fraudulence, which we are going to encounter for the duration of the poem. That's right. We're only halfway through the poem right now, and for the rest of the time, we're going to be concerned with the sins of fraudulence. And we see this fraudulence represented in Geryon's very body. Consider his body. We have the head of a human, we have the body of a serpent, and then he has an envenomed tail, like a scorpion. The human face of Geryon is very important here. It's as if he's wearing a deceptive mask, because he wants to present to his potential victims humanity. He wants to get them feeling nice and comfortable, as if he does have humanity. Although he doesn't. As we know, he represents the sin of fraudulence. And the sin of fraudulence is represented in the second part of his body, his actual body. It's serpentine. The serpent, of course, is often associated with deceit. And what about that lethal tail of his? Note the very beginning of this canto, when Geryon perches along the cliff's edge. Does he present immediately his envenomed tail that he could use to destroy these characters? No. He very slyly lets it dangle below, out of sight, over the cliff's edge. One last note on Geryon's body. It is, as we've seen, composed of 3 different parts. So what we have is 3 in 1. In this respect, we can refer to Geryon as an antichrist, because remember, Christ himself is 1 in 3. And so we have Jesus and the book of John referring to himself as the truth, and Geryon is deceit. When it comes to Geryon, though, nothing will ever beat Dante the poet's description of his slow and circling descent down into the eighth ring of hell, and what this represents about the sins of fraudulence. This is very deep and very profound, and very much worth your meditation. What happens is this. Dante and Virgil load onto Geryon's back, and Geryon takes flight. But he's taking flight downwards. He's descending down into the next ring of hell. And this descent down, as Dante describes it, is very slow and very patient and very methodical. And Geryon circles his way down, much like a falcon would. There are 2 important things to note about this descent. The first is that Virgil and Dante must rely upon an infernal creature to get down into the next region of hell. They haven't needed to do this yet. Every time that they've needed to get into a new region of hell, they've been able to do it under their own power. Yes, to get into the city of Dis, they needed to rely upon an angel to clear the way for them, but once that task was achieved, our 2 heroes were able to get into the city of Dis under their own power. Not so here. They need to rely upon this infernal beast. And this probably says something awful about the type of sin that's being punished down here, the sin of fraudulence. Some will complain, and indeed some have already complained in the comments, and with good reason, that why would Dante say that the sins of fraud are worse than the sins of violence? I mean, after all, I think as the commenter said, this means that Bernie Madoff is worse than Charles Manson. If you put it that way, yeah, I guess you're right. Bernie Madoff doesn't seem as bad as Charlie Manson. But Dante's answer, I think, is worth considering. And what Dante would say is this. It's that even animals kill. This isn't something unique to mankind. What is unique to mankind, and so what separates the sins of fraudulence from the sins of violence, is that mankind is the only animal in the animal kingdom to engage in deceit. They deceive others, often even their loved ones. They use their God-given gift of reason and intelligence to do evil. Now this for Dante is despicable and therefore worthy of more punishment than simple violence, which is carried out by ox or lions. It takes a truly depraved and degraded man to commit acts of fraud. And this is actually what's shown by Geryon's slow, plodding, circular descent down into the eighth ring of hell. The degradation of the fraudulent man. No normal spirit can just simply plunge down into this realm of sin. It takes time to develop this type of evil. These type of sinners must slowly harden themselves, sinking further down and down into their sinful nature, and probably unaware in the first place that they're even committing sin. And they remain unaware of the sins because at every step along the way where they're sinking further and further into their sin, they're actually engaged in acts of self-deception first. There's no such thing in humans as raw evil, pure evil. There's no Emperor Palpatine or Michael Myers. Human nature doesn't allow it. When evil exists, it's more of a sociological evil, and an evil that has convinced itself that it's actually good. Take, for instance, one of cinema's greatest stories of evil. That story, of course, is the story of Michael Corleone. Now, Michael Corleone, from the Godfather trilogy, he doesn't start out as a purely evil man. He doesn't start out as a murderous, avaricious thug. No, he starts out as a war hero, someone who would sacrifice himself for the benefit of his country in an effort to fight evil. And when Michael returns home from the war, he shows zero interest in joining the family business. In fact, he seems a little bit embarrassed and ashamed of the family business. And the family business, of course, if you haven't seen The Godfather, first of all, why the hell haven't you seen The Godfather? But the family business is organized crime, the mafia. But when his father is attacked by a rival mafioso, this is when Michael's slow, Geryon-esque descent into evil begins. He justifies his first criminal acts by telling himself that he's only doing this to protect his father. Next, as he slowly starts to become involved in the family business, he starts to justify his participation in this criminal, sinful enterprise by telling himself that he's doing this to protect and to provide for his family. And what's more, he's going to make the family business legitimate. These are the things that he keeps telling himself as he deceives himself into believing that the evil he's working in the world is actually good. He's doing it for good, noble reasons. Michael's slow descent down into the proverbial eighth ring of hell culminates in the second part of The Godfather, where he murders his own brother in order to protect the mafia business that he's come to inherit. So in order to protect his own family, he has convinced himself that doing violence against his own flesh and blood is a noble, worthy, and good thing to do. That is the extent of his self-deception. And from this self-deception, he is able to engage in the deception of others through the criminal enterprise of his mafia empire. This story arc of Michael Corleone is the slow descent of Geryon down into the deepest regions of hell. It's not only just deception, it's self-deception. Because in order, as I said, to deceive others, one must first deceive themselves. They must wear, like Geryon, a human face. But inside, they've turned completely monster. In today's takeaway section, we're going to complete our discussion of Seneca's De Ira, his treatise on anger. And for any new viewers, the reason that we're doing this is because we are now leaving the region of hell where the sins of violence are being punished. And for Dante, the sins of violence are always undergirded by the vice of anger. So it follows then that if we're to stop ourselves from falling into the sins of violence, we must first curb the anger within us. De Ira consists of 3 books. And for the video that we produced on Canto 14, we examined Book 1 of Seneca's De Ira. And in Book 1 of Seneca's De Ira, he sets himself the objective of defining what anger is and whether or not it can be at all of use to mankind. And what he finds is that anger is the desire to exact vengeance upon someone and to do violence to them. And he finds that there's no legitimate use for this emotion for mankind. In Book 2, which we discussed for our video for Canto 15, Seneca tries to understand whether or not anger arises naturally or whether it arises only with the aid of the mind. And what he finds is that it only arises with the aid of the mind. And what he means by that is this. Simple irascibility is just when you feel upset over something that happened to you, but your reason can tamper down the emotions that you're feeling. Anger, however, always occurs when there's an impression of injury, and the mind assents or agrees that this injury is truly injurious and worthy of wrath. Finally, in Book 3, which we discussed in the last video for Canto 16, Seneca discusses the various methods that we can employ in order to curb our anger. For today's takeaway, what I'd like to do is consider how Seneca developed his theory of anger and how it's related, tenuously, I agree, to something that happens in today's canto. Reading through Seneca's De Ira, you will find that what he's doing to develop his own thoughts on anger is he's drawing from previous philosophers, notably Aristotle and Plato, whom educated readers will no doubt recognize. So my point is that in order to develop his own thoughts, Seneca had to rely upon the thoughts of others. He had to draw from the liberal arts, here in particular from the philosophers. And Dante the poet is doing something similar in today's canto when he confronts not his anger, but his fear. In lines 106 through 120, Dante the poet describes his fearful trip on Geryon's back down into the 8th circle of hell. This is a pivotal part in the poem, and one that I feel is often overlooked. Now here Dante, in a moment of utmost fear, reflects upon, or at least considers, the stories of Phaethon and Icarus. Now why would Dante the poet choose these two mythological figures to consider, or at least be associated with, his fearful descent down into the 8th ring of hell? Well, let's look at the two stories of Phaethon and Icarus to find out maybe one of the reasons why. First, we're going to use the stories as they appear in Ovid, because Ovid's Metamorphosis is probably the text that Dante was drawing from and was most familiar with when he was writing the Divine Comedy. And don't forget, Ovid appears as one of the greatest poets of all time up in limbo. Looking at Ovid, we find first that the sun is at the heart of both of these stories. In the Phaethon story, Phaethon is constantly teased by his friends one day about his paternity. His friends say that there's no way that your father is Helios, the sun god. And so, Phaethon, in an effort to prove to them that yes, his father is indeed Helios, goes to Helios and seeks out kind of like a paternity test, I guess. Now, when they're talking, Phaethon and Helios, Phaethon gets this idea that he wants to drive the chariot of the sun across the sky, which is what Helios is tasked with doing. During their conversation, because Helios is so happy to see his son, he offers his son the fulfillment of any wish that his son could have. And Phaethon, of course, says, well, I want to drive the chariot. And right away, Helios understands that this would be a disaster, that his son is not prepared or strong enough to do this. But because he made the promise, he allows it to happen. But first, Helios does his best to dissuade his son, Phaethon, from riding the carriage. But Phaethon will not listen to his father. He disobeys his father, and he insists that Helios gives him the reins to the chariot of the sun. And what happens? Well, as he's flying the chariot of the sun through the sky, just like Helios said would happen, he loses control of it, and the sun starts to destroy the earth. And Jupiter, seeing this, acts very quickly and strikes the chariot and Phaethon with a thunderbolt, killing Phaethon. Ovid presents a similar story for Icarus. Now, you may recall from a previous video where we discussed briefly the story of Daedalus and how he needed to trap the Minotaur in this intricate maze, and he did that. The only problem was he too got stuck in the maze with Icarus, his son. And so what Daedalus does is he constructs these wax wings that he gives to Icarus, his son, and to himself, and they're going to fly out of the maze. Now, before they take off, Daedalus the father instructs Icarus the son not to fly too close to the sun, for the sun's heat will melt the wax feathers and he'll plunge down into his death. What happens? Well, similar to the story of Helios the father and Phaethon the doomed son, we have Daedalus offering perfectly reasonable advice to his son Icarus. Icarus, like Phaethon, disobeys his father. He flies too close to the sun and he plunges to his death. So to review, what we have here is Dante in a moment of abject terror, recalling two mythological stories concerning A, the sun, and B, young men who meet their ultimate demise because they disobeyed their father. For me, this may very well be the height of Dante as the great remixer, where he's using pagan stories to illustrate Christian lessons. In these wonderful stanzas of Dante's descent down into the eighth circle of hell, we have a major Christian doctrine illustrating a central Christian moral teaching presented by means of various pagan mythical stories. If we pay close attention to these stanzas, we see that there is a major Christian doctrine hidden within these verses, and that doctrine is the doctrine of Trinitarianism, the Christian truth that God exists in three consubstantial persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We see the Father and the Son represented in the mythical stories that we've just reviewed. Both stories feature a father figure who offers wise counsel. Both also feature the Son, which in the work of the early church fathers is often used as a symbol of the Son, Jesus Christ. Finally, in these stanzas, we also have the Holy Spirit represented in all the wind that Dante the Pilgrim feels rushing up and blowing over his face. Wind, of course, is one of the biblical symbols for the Holy Spirit. We can find this in John 3:8 and Acts chapter 2 during the Pentecost story. I believe that this is the point where Dante the Pilgrim really finds his way back onto the straight path and out of the dark woods. And the evidence I offer in support of this theory is that it's at this point in the story where Dante the Pilgrim, unlike Phaethon and unlike Icarus, really does seem to grasp the central teaching that in order to avoid a fall into sin, one must follow the wise counsels of the Father in heaven. And in fact, from this point forward, we're going to see a marked difference in Dante the Pilgrim's character. From this point forward, he's going to be able to more fluidly and easily and joyfully negotiate these deeper regions of hell. And I think this is because he's had a moral revelation here as he's descending down into the eighth ring of hell. And he's able to do this because, just like Seneca, he consulted the wisdom of others here in the mythological stories that we talked about and in the Christian faith. And this is something that we all can learn from. All right, that's my video for Canto 17 of Dante's Inferno. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, I would please ask you to like the video and also subscribe to the channel. Remember that we're trying to get up to 200 subscribers by the end of October. At the time of recording, we're at 174 subscribers, so it is a totally achievable goal for us with your help, and I thank you in advance for that. But more importantly than getting likes and subscriptions is getting a conversation going down in the comments. That's what we're here for. This is kind of like a book club, or at least that's how I envision it. So I would invite you all to please offer your own opinions, not only on the canto and the poem, but also on my opinion on the canto and the poem in general. Let me know what you think. I'm very eager to learn what you think. Finally, if you want to get in touch with me, you can also get in touch with me on Twitter at Brian E. Denton. And aside from that, we're going to be releasing these videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And I know in previous videos, I've told you I'm going to get these videos out in the mornings, except on Monday. But as it happens, sometimes I just can't get them out in the mornings. I need a little bit of extra time. So I ask you to indulge me with your patience. And I hope that the videos that I can produce will be well worth your time. All right. So Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. We're definitely going to get them out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The time, though, I can't promise. Hopefully in the mornings. But the next video will be released on Monday. And until then, take care of yourselves and others.